course, thank you for allowing me to have this time to present today. This topic on today is something I'm trying to coin as horizontal momentum to foster better communication, collaboration, and training across disciplines. And it's inspired by something that struck me at a series of specific conferences I was able to attend that are very interdisciplinary in nature, but also stems from having a very interdisciplinary sort of mindset over the years that I've started from chemical engineering, moved into bioinformatics, and then systems biology as sort of the segue into second master's degree titles in systems and synthetic biology, which is a beautiful synergy to be able to bridge systems level computational modeling and wet lab validation to actually bridge many of the issues that I'll get into around basically my take on some academic publishing norms and drivers that can sometimes lead us astray, and just sort of the driving principles will be looking at different ways of thinking and different ways of sort of, much like science pushes us to do, question things that maybe are not as frequently questioned. So sort of one of the paradigms, as we sort of advertised online for this event today, this talk, is around conventional science and ways of thinking versus sort of solidifying and making a more rigorous approach around unconventional approaches and making that more robust. So as a sort of starting reference, this is a YouTube video. It's a little bit hidden with just the way the syntax, the format is. There's an underspace where you see only an underline, but the title of the YouTube video is visible in bold there. This is a video I made entitled Journey Through Autism and Ways of Thinking, sort of a system sciences approach framework thinking about something that many people might have some awareness around, but not very many people, at least in my eyes, are just inspiring me to tackle this from a system science perspective of observations and how we can better describe what is this thing that I would say really suffers from reductionism. That reductionism is something that innately, just the question, the notion that a question can only allow for one answer is inherently reductive. But it's a very pervasive force that reductionism tends to shape a lot of structures in the world that we interact with as professionals, not only like me as a researcher in science and research, but even just broadly, professionals of all walks of life interact with structures of reductionism. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's something that I wanted to highlight as sort of the driving principles with this specific example as something that people might think they know a little bit about, say, what it means to be autistic. And I wanted to tackle how to best describe the autistic cognitive experience as best as I could represent the spectrum, as much of the spectrum as I could, in 4 minutes. So feel free to check that out as a past video. And getting a little bit deeper into reductionism, started by framing that the notion that a question can only allow for one answer is inherently reductive. So just looking at anything and saying, we have this challenge, we need to think about how to solve it. What is the answer? Maybe it's not the most informed to say there can only be one answer for this thing as we're trying to frame it. And a lot of what I'm going to try to point to is looking at what we think we understand in terms of textbook style knowledge, our human comprehension of knowledge. And maybe there's some principles that were foundational that we have been building on top of for centuries or many decades. And it might present as we've known this has been true in fact and unquestionable for centuries or many decades. Why would we have to change our mind now? And something I'll be getting deeper into is something that this sort of framework around reductionism as just an innate driver of how we think is really driving us just naturally as human beings to really push and look for what it is that we can simplify from extreme complexity in a sort of evolutionary sense. What is simple enough that you can comprehend something about it, that you can survive, to make sense out of complexity and actually get out alive. So it's a very evolutionary basis and driver, but it's also something that, as I put towards the bottom of this slide, I don't envision that it would be possible to abandon reductionism. So I think taking action on being more informed around what it is that reductionism is shaping and what we can do about it, is to grow more awareness around what it actually is and when we're invoking it, rather than treating it as bad or evil or expecting that it could be even possible at all, to completely abandon or eradicate it on any complete degree. The title of the talk around the wording of horizontal momentum is based around sort of two different definitions, two different drivers of how I decided to name it. You can sort of picture conventional ways of thinking with sort of a proxy. A good place to point it out would be academic publishing incentives and structures. And I sort of call it a proxy because many things that we treat just with the process of knowledge aggregation over time, from proposing a new idea or hypothesis to consensus and having agreement. Academic publishing tends to move in what I would call a vertical progression that builds up a lot of momentum in the one direction, that's driven by a bunch of reductive forces, as I would describe. So the notion, again, that there can only be one answer for a given question, and another notion of stay in your lane professionally, I would call inherently reductive. But it's very pervasive, and it's very difficult to push past that as a professional, to look beyond what might be very clear to you in your primary discipline. How would you actually establish better confidence for better communication, collaboration, and training across disciplines, and not just within this vertical bin that, like I mentioned, we've known this has been fact for decades or centuries. What if the path forward that is so unflinching in that way of, this is the way forward, don't question what we have proven is fact and unflinching, and this is the path forward, don't question it, don't stay in your lane, don't look outside and across the fence from I'm a this, I can't comment on that, as a super specialist sort of mindset that a bunch of professionals, not only in science and STEM, but just across the board, tend to operate in these very tiny bins. And the reason I call it a vertical presentation, or way of visualizing it, is that you basically have this progression from the past, building up and up in that same direction, and that track might have been set decades or centuries before you ever entered that space in your professional life. But who's to say that that direction that was decided eons ago is still serving us well? So not only for just common momentum of an entire discipline, but even just many structures that we have designed and decided on over time, like in Western medicine, a specialty is decided to be specializing on an organ. And that's done some good for us, but there are many examples where that leads us astray or is not very adequate or representative to tackle every type of solution that sort of drives what becomes low-hanging fruit to solve. So sort of thinking as both a scientist and an engineer, there are many things that we could solve if we could reframe what we sort of evaluate as progress or successfully making that progress on a very individualistic level, that we can define what is progress to any one of us and what is success moving towards that. Can we even agree on the same metrics of success if we don't even have the same metrics or goals of progress? These are sort of some of the principles that are actually already actively shaping the vertical bins of basically the discipline that the other driver of what drove me to choose this name, horizontal momentum, comes from the horizontal data analysis I do as a systems biologist. Where systems biology is basically a sum of parts approach that specializes on interactions and connectivity in biology instead of any one domain expertise like neuroscience or immunology. And I've noticed if you try to establish any confidence or professional success across those boundaries, there are so many forces that resist any momentum to cross or transverse those vertical bins. And in systems biology, I interface with a lot of data repositories and just doing that horizontal data analysis. All these repositories are shaped in these vertical bins where you've got every so often a repository of more than just one study's data sets. But it'll be per condition or per methodology of the way it was collected. or just all these vertical bins that you might have an aggregation in one of those bins, but to build enough momentum going horizontally across those bins feels like you have to pioneer that space. So you have to basically reevaluate what would progress look like and sort of start over in what becomes, if you can sort of envision the vertical momentum paradigm, there are many niches professionally that are highly trafficked, have a lot of momentum, but not much room to make more than an incremental contribution on top of standing on the shoulders of giants of this is what we've tried, this is what you could sort of carve out on the cutting edge beyond it, adjacent to it, but to go and carve out a new unattempted solution space or uncharacterized, unacknowledged problem space would be much more challenging in this set of incentives. But that's not to say it would be less fruitful. It's not to say it would be impossible. So that's sort of what I'd like to tackle as sort of reevaluating what we would treat as progress and success based on what is in the past and what do we need in the future. So really just drilling home the notion of what academic publishing incentives really drive home or just really center around is looking at you have to justify any claims that you want to propose with evidence. That much is working quite well, I would say. But the rest of what they expect is that you're not expected to question or even have any possibility of being able to overturn past knowledge. And there's this assumption that repetition and consistency must mean something has a factual basis. And this goes even far beyond academic publishing, where just having repetition and something that sounds consistent tends to just enter our brains and sound factual, trustworthy. And there's things that people cite all the time that might not be grounded in evidence, or there's things that were maybe once the state-of-the-art best understanding of what something could be described as and understood as scientifically, that maybe is not representative once we got better knowledge moving forward. And how would we actually address this to build up any momentum moving horizontally in these unattempted solution spaces or problem spaces that might not even be acknowledged? So there's probably more of the solution spaces that are unattempted in terms of a combination with problem space, rather than saying there are so many problems that we've never even acknowledged and have no idea where to begin with. But just the notion of not knowing how we would start is something that I've tried to address with sort of the automation and scalability framework stemming from chemical engineering, and then stepping from chemical engineering into bioinformatics, from, let's say, high throughput chemical production to high throughput biology and genome science. That fits very nicely into automation and how we can take individual steps that would really be difficult to have to do manually over and over again, but are really amenable to nicely be able to automate. I find is analogous and works quite well for knowledge and knowledge aggregation and advice to build consensus of what we can actually agree on. So in terms of these existing solution frameworks, where there might be a solution space that is unattempted in the given problem space that's already carved out, has a lot of momentum and not much room left to go in terms of low-hanging fruit is already fully tackled, and what's left to go. If we just keep following the direction of what people have already been pushing and the gradual progress of the cutting edge as we currently know how to incentivize. What if instead we could look at existing solution frameworks that have a successful track record and could be amenable to reapply elsewhere? And that's what I've been trying to work towards, building up a more robust framework to basically support this fostering of better communication, collaboration, and training across disciplines for all the untapped potential of if you were to only ever look at what people say is the right way to do something and the conventional way, maybe we'll never expand fast enough to make enough progress or successfully push into all these unattempted solution spaces and untackled problem spaces that where we might have minimal progress and the incremental progress you can make as a super subspecialist in a tiny niche that you might do in just the current paradigm that reductionism really shapes. Maybe that won't be sufficient, so we have to look a little beyond that. This is to really drill home in terms of a pair of words, progress and success. I would argue that a lot of us can agree that we are in closer agreement already around how we define making success, or successfully making change, or just getting work done, having impact, and how that interacts with progress, while how we individually define what progress means to us is more variable. And that's something that really fits in nicely with the sort of drivers of, I guess I would say, the personalized approach that I've been able to take across my career, where I really had to push beyond individual niches and individual conventional pathways. Because if I were to take the advice or the remaining solutions and resources available from my lived experience, the advice I was given was to give up. One of the titles I call myself is a patient turned researcher, because half my life ago I was diagnosed with this rare disease that no doctor knew how to treat. And I was referred to 50 different specialists in 2 short years, exhausted all treatment options with no symptom relief, very mysteriously, because I had histological remission, which means that what they actually measure as a biomarker showed that everything should be fine. Everything is normal, but something was not adding up. And they just told me there were no treatments left to trial, no doctors left to refer me to, and goodbye and good luck, and you may never find relief, but goodbye, you have to leave now. Please don't book me again, I won't be helpful. Goodbye now. Good luck, but goodbye. And I wouldn't take that for an answer. Decided half my life ago to go into research, and I was able to carve out this professional path that started with chemical engineering with a biomedical focus, and then bioinformatics with a sort of computing focus in that medical research on top of the chemical engineering framework. And then systems and synthetic biology, I chose trying to look at this sort of paradigm of 2 terms I would say could coin as not wanting to get stuck in theoretical land and not wanting to merely publish into the abyss, which is just with current incentives happens all too often. It's all too easy to do with the current incentives of academic publishing. And even beyond just being in academia, I find those are sort of a strong proxy for just how we treat knowledge and how we can treat the path forward and what to do about it. So those 2 terms I coined, just to elaborate a little bit. Publishing into the abyss is basically building on top of the notion that's a little bit more well-known, publish or perish. That academia really optimizes for quantity over quality. That it becomes a game about numbers, and winning that game of numbers really just comes down to quantity. But we never stop to think about and realize that so much of what we do is basically looking at what all we can do with the specialties that we choose in our professional training, that we subspecialize into this very narrow niche, and we develop these jargon walls. And to boot, we also have this notion of stay in your lane professionally, don't look over there. I'm in this, I can't comment on that once you specialize. So there's all these challenges that basically drive it to become, at best case, you would be able to publish into the abyss after you make your incremental contribution from your specialty on an already carved out problem that's got a lot of momentum and a lot of people that have already addressed from other directions, many different niches, but each professional only able to add one niche, one little incremental piece of progress or contribution that we hope can make progress and change and impact. But that impact is not necessarily something that we can prove is going to work with the current incentives, or at least reflectively I would say it's not working, not enough. That there's so many things that we basically just say, at best case, you publish into the abyss after you make your incremental contribution and hope that someone will find it and make their incremental contribution to add a little bit more if they find your paper. But given that search is not a finished or solved problem yet, even beyond just what we typically think of a web search like Google search, even just looking at biomedical literature, it can be difficult to find everything that's out there. And there's constantly people referring to, or increasingly referring to, how there's an exponential rise in the amount of work that people are publishing just in any one given niche or journal or say NCBI PubMed as a whole. But it becomes very difficult to keep up And I've learned that there are quite a number of professionals that have told me about work they published over 50 years ago that never gets picked up. And it's arguably difficult if it's just the incentives of publishing into the abyss and not being able to do more than the tiny incremental contribution from your narrow subspecialty. So how would we build more confidence to actually work across disciplines and be able to communicate, collaborate, and build training better across disciplines? And the reason I'd really hype on those three terms, communication, collaboration, and training, centers a lot around what I would reference back to textbook style knowledge in a few different ways. There's the way that we sort of view what we think we know about the world as what we can fit into a textbook. But there's also the era of LLM era tools. We might be able to improve the gap of how long it takes for new knowledge that crosses over the cutting edge, that's in writing, proven and justifiable, to eventually make its way into either any given textbook or just broadly the materials for professional training. And professional training tends to happen only once in a professional's career. There's a few oddball exceptions that will try to incentivize continuous learning, but it's arguably difficult to keep up with the cutting edge and everything that's out there. And some would say there's a need to keep a delay or some necessary gap between the cutting, bleeding edge and what we can actually apply from there. But I would say the vast majority of that gap that remains today could be automated away. So I think it really comes down to exercising the translational axis, which, as I'll get into in the final slides of the slide deck, really just comes down to sort of applying a combination of an existing solution framework that could be very well proven and successful somewhere else, and a problem space that's already carved out and known, and just combining them in a way that's novel, without having to ever make any new discovery of new knowledge or invention. You can still have room for innovation, but you're just combining pieces that are already out there and learning from disciplines. If you can translate the knowledge and lessons from this disparate literature or discipline or niche, that could lead us a long way. So this one I'll come back to. This is, I think, a good example of something that imprinted on me early in my studies in my first master's in bioinformatics and systems biology, where it's a very wordy slide. Don't worry about studying every last word during the talk. But I find it's a very great example of what was imprinted on me from this lesson about text mining of biomedical literature. Actually, it came up before the hype or really birth of large language models, but still fits nicely into automation and scaling up, being able to take advantage of technology like the older natural language processing, like parts of speech tagging, and now large language model text summarization, where you can take all of PubMed and summarize, for example, with this tool called eGift, that was the lesson taught to me in my first master's that really imprinted with me. This tool took all of the PDFs that were open source and free from all of PubMed and had already pre-computed text mining to look at the most insightful ranked sentences from all of literature. So you could query a human gene name of any of the 20,000 plus genes, and it would tell you the most insightful sentences that it ranked from all of literature that gives you an idea of its function. And you didn't have to hallucinate or synthesize new text from that. You just had to highlight existing text that was summarized from the entirety of PubMed, as you could reasonably acquire with free open source PDFs, which is plenty. And similarly, this example, I was able to use Perplexity AI to give it an example of text mining along the same vein as eGift around this set of concepts with fish oil and Raynaud's syndrome, which come from disparate literatures, but we're pointing at each other with overlapping concepts and saying, hey, we know this about our specialty, and it looks like this could be relevant over there. And both of them saying it vice versa, but no one tasked or incentivized to build confidence or be allowed to or even care about combining these disciplines and connecting those dots, which is something I try very hard to do as a systems biologist. And I was able to take that example of text mining of biomedical literatures, where this previous work had taken those disparate concepts from separate literatures that were overlapping concepts from disparate literatures or different niches, and say, hey, they're actually equitable. They're talking about each other, they match up. There could be a plausible way to do science with these, or make an engineering application out of these. And I was able to take that example of biomedical literature text mining to a tool that can do text mining of biomedical literature, and it gave further examples of biomedical literature text mining successes. And I didn't have to make any new discovery, just like the original example was not based on new discoveries or new experiments, just taking existing knowledge that's out there, not necessarily easy to find, but very much possible to apply and exercise that translational access to go from old knowledge, it doesn't have to be a new discovery, old solutions, don't have to reinvent the wheel, but if you just plug them in a novel combination, you can make impact and it can be successful. And just really driving home what I was able to do in my career working as a computational biologist, I've been able to basically source and deploy software without almost ever having to write my own code. And that's not to say I don't know how to code, which you can refer back to the YouTube video on the one beginning earlier slides with a MATLAB coding demo specifically. But I was able to find that you could make impact and successfully finish work that could have impact to the real world and be relevant to making progress, and not just get stuck in theoretical land with work that would build in incremental steps where maybe the closest approach to reality was back here, it's centuries ago or decades ago, where we're up here in this vertical progression, but the closest approach to reality was back there. And we're still trying to figure out why we're not getting more relevant to reality and not getting closer to the solution or fixing something specific or improving quality of life for the most people. And that's just something that I would say broadly, we're still trying to understand better. The last slide I'll address in the slide deck is this framework that I learned about 12 months ago at the DeSci London conference about decentralized science, which shares a lot of pillars and foundations with DeFi, decentralized finance, but with the ultimate goal of decentralizing away from huge institutions that hoard data and resist collaborations to eventually decentralize towards the point that anyone and everyone can contribute to research and science without so much of the gatekeeping that we're stuck with still today. We've come a long way, and likewise with reductionism, I would say it served us well, but we should aim to look beyond the era of reductionism and embrace synergies in a way that I think the DeSci community has done quite well. The most common vehicle type or org type is a vehicle called a DAO. DeSci DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations in decentralized science, DeSci DAOs. And this is a little map that's quite a bit outdated now, and it's difficult to find a map that even gets close to mapping out this well. Very quickly changing field and community, but these are some of the specific orgs. Majority of them are DAOs that have aimed to carve out a niche to address how science and research are broken today and how we can attempt to fix or improve them. Between publishing paradigms, box for publishing up there, financing, data storage and protocols with sort of blockchain technology, Web3 applications of the theoretical frameworks that are a little less traveled in the current world, or at least the historical basis of what we have treated as legitimate and have a lot of momentum built up on. Just because something is newer or has a younger track record doesn't mean we shouldn't put so much hope into trying it. And I guess the final thought I would say is that name one thing in this world that's not negotiable, and find something that when it looks like you've exhausted all the resources or possibilities in conventional understanding and senses, try to carve out the unconventional and flesh out how you can build confidence, dabbling with immunology if you're a neuroscientist or vice versa, where your training might be decades old, of the up-to-date training that completed decades ago was already decades old when you had that training from a textbook of neuroscience that commented on immunology, but didn't actually have it up to date in that old version of the book. The book was not even up the newest version or modified recently when the instructor chose it. And you're propagating all these delays, but there's so much left to go with progress left to make that we can successfully do and have impact without having to incentivize or solely focus on sort of numbers game of software developers make new software and academics publish more papers. But what if you could look beyond those barriers and figure out the most coherent and productive path forward together and get closer to forming consensus, combining what we individually view as progress and successfully making that change, and just what the path forward looks like. I would definitely point to the DSci community as a successful set of young track records that I would call very successful towards making change. And with that, I will conclude the primary section of my talk and open for questions.
Thanks for the talk. So it sounds like you're saying that in academia, for example, there's a microphone. Hi, I'm William. I'm a data scientist at a hotel chain nearby, and very interesting talk. So it sounds like you're saying, like in academia, for example, that instead of focusing on a particular niche subject and publish paper, just building on previous results, you're saying we should explore other discipline and maybe if we can we are maybe able to solve problems by a unique combination of different disciplines that led to true innovation, true progress in scientific research. I guess it is a really great idea, and there are two forces in academia that kind of resist that kind of change. One is the idea of risk. As you mentioned, the tenureship, once you get tenure, this PhD, you got limited funding. It's kind of risky for the researcher to bet their future 5-10 years of career on a risky, unproven path to going that route. So I guess, how would you convince a young starting researcher to take the leap of faith? And the second resistance is the established academia, like all those authorities. Their career is built upon the old way of thinking, and this new way is kind of threatening their entire career, and they will try their best to influence the journal publication process, the peer review process, to resist that kind of new disruptive idea from burgeoning up. So I guess, what ideas you have in overcoming these two forces and make this kind of innovation possible?
I appreciate the questions. The first thing I would want to drill home is the importance of building up enough confidence to dabble with some discipline outside your primary bubble, your primary discipline, that forms such a bubble of just resisting any ability to look across the fence, or that whole notion of stay in your lane professionally and I'm a this, I can't comment on that. So I'll preface it now with don't just overcorrect too far to the other extreme of losing professionalism. You still would want to retain the professional approach to rigorously handle something outside your primary discipline. But just beginning that pathway, where no one's really doing enough or beginning the conversation enough in that direction. Stay cognizant of what it would look like if you were to no longer preserve that professionalism of operating outside your discipline, of your primary discipline where you have the most expertise. You should be cognizant of what the risks might look like if you were to overspeak and say something that you don't have as much confidence about, and being able to communicate what confidence you do have and what you do know about. I have this training from this, or I've seen some speculation of that, sort of work that into that type of communication when you start to dabble outside your primary discipline. But just being able to build enough confidence to break free from that escape philosophy, to actually dabble with another discipline that maybe you did cover for 5 minutes of your training when you had your professional training long time ago, of what you know about this interfacing field, and say, I know I learned it as this, and I think I've seen that since I learned that officially or from the professional training. What would your take be? And just start to try to create a framework that way, of a collaborative way to actually dabble with and try to learn other people's walks of life without having to step all over it and say that you have to be in charge or assert that you have the most confidence or expertise. Just to remain open-minded, not only to learning directly from other people and maybe automating textbook writing someday with LLM era tools and beyond, but even just the perspective of what is the allowed path forward can span far beyond what we sort of have the most momentum, the most conventional pathways carved out as today.
I'm particularly interested in what you said about consistency and repetition happening in academic journals and such. And one of the ways that this shows up is, of course, with citations. The more cited you are, the more important your paper is, the more important your idea is. Have you given any thought of a more, I don't know what the word is, fair or innovative new way in which we can discover or mark core ideas that, will have real weight in the reality of the science?
Yeah, appreciate the question. One thing I don't have as much in terms of direct slides to point to, but it's still continuing effort I'm working very hard on, is figuring out how to take advantage of LLM era tools to accelerate knowledge aggregation, including pointing out there are these concepts or knowledge claims that you could source evidence to. And it sort of overlaps quite quickly with fact checking, which is not necessarily my focus, but certainly an unsolved problem in terms of automating fact checking. But just being able to source, here are the underlying concepts in a paper or a literature across multiple publishers and years in the same niche, or whatever radius you attach or sign in a niche, or just a focus, even if it's beyond a very subspecialized niche. And trying to tackle how to take advantage and benefit from automation and LLMs and natural language processing, like parts of speech tagging. I'm still trying to figure out how to make it more robust. So I didn't have as many slides to point to as finalized today. But I think one of the most important takeaways I've found is to highlight the transparency that is sometimes lacking with the most popular LLM chatbots, where hallucinations don't have to be the end-all and fatal if you were to be able to add transparency. So if you can add checks and balances and visibility where there are inconsistencies or hallucinations, and you can actually say, this is fully inconsistent with what a human could curate, on the sense of how we generally define an LLM hallucination, or even beyond that, as you're pointing out with citations. Sometimes something gets cited so many times that we end up finding what we're looking for, even if it's not what's really out there. It's just what we keep saying we think we know on the textbook level of our human knowledge. It's not to say that we're never wrong or always right. So again, just being aware of things that are old paradigms and old knowledge that have maybe never been revisited or questioned or reevaluated with new evidence is really problematic. So there's a couple layers across the text mining that I'm hopeful of being able to make more robust around identifying the claims, sourcing the evidence, and elucidating what actually is backed by more evidence or enough evidence, if you could measure it or make a metric that way to benchmark. But even beyond the text mining would be reevaluating data in open source data repositories and thinking about what would it take to reevaluate very old claims, the oldest of the things that we think are just rigid with no room for fluidity. And how would we even develop robust studies of new data collection around that? And I think that's a very early stage problem that not many people have even begun to characterize, to sort of even be open to overturning that much knowledge from textbooks and just old knowledge that we think is true. But even just to point out You started your question focusing on the academic publishing side and the citations around repetition and consistency, just striking the human mind as that must be factual. Far outside of academic publishing, I find it's even more frequent that people will refer to, oh, I saw this reference, and if you slow down and ask, where did you see that cited, what was the source you found, you can start to unpack and see someone most of the time realize, oh, I guess I just heard it a bunch and it sounded reputable, but sometimes you don't have anything to point to as what the citation is. And there's a lot of stuff that makes its way into scientific publishing that is maybe no longer, or sometimes never, as robust as we thought we were sticking it into written records. So just because something is old or even replicated should not be the end all of what is infallible or the truth that's out there.
I'll ask one. So, like the presentation, awesome. I can definitely relate a lot to it. So, on your end, do you see any other kind of movements, even within the old structures, in terms of how they're culturally moving that kind of lean more into this? So, I'm a biologist by training, and I'm here and I hang out with a bunch of computer scientists for most of my week. And on one end, I see a little bit of direction towards this. Like one example being a lot of modern PhDs who do something in genetics will end up having to learn Python at some point. But aside from that, do you have any other kind of examples that you see on your end of kind of this more fusion of different disciplines kind of moving together?
Sure. There's a great example I like to point out from genetics of something that just really was like turning the paradigm on its head when the J. Craig Venter Institute, JCVI, managed to make the minimalist bacterial genome. They were able to take a bacteria that already had a very small genome, very few genes that it already naturally had relative to most bacteria, most organisms just broadly, and very small genome outside of those genes, so not much excess outside of those genes to begin with in the natural bacterium. And then they engineered it to have a much smaller genome that was able to keep replicating and being alive as a biological bacterium with a fraction of the genes that we thought were necessary to sustain life based on individual gene knockout studies. And this is something that I find is a great proxy of what we might have to rethink. And then I'll get to sort of what are some of the communities that might be doing a better job of this. Just the fact that so much of what we know about genetics is defined around the paradigm of, well, what happens when the gene is broken or you can mutate it? You either find a mutation or make a mutation that breaks the gene and therefore the protein is non-functional, is the driving paradigm assumption of how we can measure genetics. And what if that paradigm is not sufficient to be representative of what we actually know, or what is actually out there about genetics, or proteins, or all these things that stem secondary from genetics, that just is from that flawed or not quite perfect approach, where it even came up in my coursework in systems and synthetic biology, Université Paris-Saclay in Évry-Courcouronnes in France, that we actually know some mechanisms where there's all these things that, beyond even this specific mechanism, people tend to look much like the repetition and consistency of what looks factual. People tend to trust the common sense and common knowledge of what should be possible and sort of push away what could be possible and plausible to evaluate that maybe has never gotten enough attention or support to get evaluated in a rigorous way in research or anywhere else. And maybe could actually support evidence in a really strong pattern, but we never even build enough support to do that. So really the reason I started this train of thought and this horizontal momentum presentation theme stemmed from the DSI London conference I attended in January 2023, where I saw a bunch of people discussing sort of the philosophical and problem-solving approaches of understanding how research and science are broken today and how we can try to fix them and do something about it today. I noticed at that conference where this idea struck me that no one was really starting this conversation or having this conversation. So progress to me would be beginning enough of a seed to get people to think about this radical level of change and how to justify making enough change to actually be interdisciplinary and not just talk about it in an academic sense, but actually manage to pull it off and attempt it and maybe be successful. So there are a few academic groups or just a few groups broadly that I would say have been more successful, but I've yet to see anyone really address it outside of their primary bubble. Not to say they're not looking outside the primary bubble as much as they sort of only operate within the sphere of system sciences or DSci community members. And it's very difficult to integrate and intermingle crosstalk. So I think it's something that a lot of people will aspire to be interdisciplinary and be able to connect those dots and work professionally across disciplines, but to actually build those collaborations and communicate across those disciplines and improve the out-of-date training professional knowledge across those disciplines, I think still has a long way to go. There are a few academic branches I could point to that are doing quite well and as big of a radius as they've managed to make so far. ISSS, the International Society for the System Sciences, is where I presented the first iteration of this horizontal momentum theme last June at the annual conference in Kruger National Park within South Africa. And that's certainly a community I learned is very passionate about embracing systems level perspectives and systems thinking in the system sciences. But I would say they just tend to have a more academic approach to understanding the system sciences than even I have arrived at myself, or just the way I've operated my career. Not to say one is better, as much as just there are ways of going about understanding and studying how we can solve interdisciplinary collaborations in an academic sense, where you could carve out one niche or question to approach, or even one strategy like systems thinking, system sciences, that can get quite academic. And it still remains a challenge, I would say, to translate that from academia so that you don't get stuck in theoretical land and only build in that one direction that maybe it's going skyscraper high, but no longer approaching reality. And that's something that I think is difficult for a lot of people to acknowledge or even realize, even beyond just being willing to acknowledge. So I would say it still remains to be solved to a large degree.
Please,
yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was really good. I have a few questions actually. So first of all, you mentioned that okay, we have some existing knowledge, existing evidence, and we can bridge some things with particular tools. Doesn't really matter. Shouldn't we like do the study after, because it doesn't seem like it's enough, you know? What do you think about it? Like what's your anything you can comment?
So when you say it's, I'm just trying to grasp your full question. When it is not enough, are you pointing to the proposed solution or approach of sorry, can you repeat that?
So, for example, if you like scroll back to, I think, third from the last slide, where was the example with the fish oil.
Yes.
So yeah, for example, here we should like run additional study, right? If we can see some correlation, it's not enough to just see some similar patterns and say, okay, we can see something new, because it might not be, right? Okay.
Yeah, certainly. I would say that's a great point, and that I don't hope to propose that this would be, or anything like this would be the end all, and like, pack up, we're done, we succeeded. Science is never finished. Progress is always still remaining. But being able to envision the path forward once you understand a problem space and a solution space well enough doesn't just have to stop in the conventional realm of sort of the dry wording of publishing to the abyss. The way I think about it, even beyond the phrasing, is that we tend to only operate on our skill set, like being a data scientist or a microbiologist or a neuroimmunologist, where you look at, I've done my part, I worked on this project that someone handed me or I found published that I could add my contribution to, but what comes next? And we tend to not think about what comes next, because that's not my job, that's not my responsibility. I'm at this, I can't comment on that. Don't look across the fence, stay in your lane professionally. So instead, if we could begin to even embrace that systems thinking and bigger picture thinking more broadly than even just what is your role what would it look like to collaborate with other people, or to actually be able to delegate what you envision someone else could do? Or just what is the collective path forward that we could agree on consensus around, where we could individually define, hey, I think progress to move forward might look like this, and here's how we could successfully attempt it or define it. If we can agree on what that consensus looks like, we don't have to stop at publishing into the abyss. We don't have to stop at, well, I can only do this one study, or my funding ended, therefore I have to move to new funding and a new study. If you could actually follow a pipeline of the problem that you're solving across skill sets, as I prefer to do in my career of collecting disciplines, you can still have a viable approach. You can still have a viable chance of success. And if we can get it closer on the same page of agreeing what consensus could look like to move forward and how we can get there, I think we can get there faster.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. I guess my response would be sometimes it's not trivial to cross-check some work which stems in different fields, because although you can ask some peers from different fields to review their parts, the whole might be not actually true. It still happens. Yeah, and the second question I had is, so which institutional changes do you think has to be made in order to facilitate this approach? Because from my experience, I have 2 master's degree. Should people just get 2 master's degree instead of 1, or what? Should they spend 15 years of their life?
I mean, certainly there's a long way to go. There's a lot of progress left to make. And I would say that just being able to understand what a viable path forward looks like doesn't have to even be the conventional pathway that has so much momentum of, oh, it looks like a degree can warrant that I know what I'm talking about. If we can establish with enough consensus and agreement that we can actually prove we know what we're doing and justify the expertise and the skill set that we're doing the work with and proposing with a solution. Maybe it doesn't have to be continuing or multiplying degrees or staying in academia. And I think it's actually productive to look not just at, I trained for this, my degree qualifies me for this, I stay in this adjacent industry or associated from the academia to industry relation. If you look horizontally, if you look outside of the vertical bins that we're so encouraged to not look outside of, you can actually have far more potential than we've tapped into so far, looking beyond what would be like the conventional go-to is, looks like I need more training, I need another degree. I wouldn't say that a degree is the end all. And I would say there's plenty left to go. And as far as the institutional side, one of the other titles I've embraced for myself is a citizen scientist, under the primary definition of research done without any institutional affiliation. So there's a couple other definitions proposed and bouncing around. My co-author that I managed to publish with in the last day of 2021 is even more of a true citizen scientist than me, because he has arguably no professional or scientific training, no scientific professional training. But he was able to justify his work, show that he had enough robust rigor, and he's able to lead the effort. And we got it published with a community ethics board using consumer genetic data in a polygenic bioinformatic analysis, where it was entirely novel, but we were able to find new knowledge from sort of a computational prediction that still has to be replicated and verified outside of the computational realm, but able to make progress and have a say, and not just have to sit on the sideline like the current incentives and institutional drivers expect. So there's still a long way left to go to embrace sort of the citizen scientist branding and spirit of not waiting for an institution to have buy-in to drive everything that we must do. But I would say that DSci community, again, can be a great set of case studies that have been really chipping away at that, not only for academic publishing, that trying to resolve or improve publish or perish, and sort of my own coining of publishing into the abyss, but just across the board, there's many niches that open science is, of course, a great one to point out in the bottom left corner, that the Center for Open Science is even where my co-author and I in citizen science put our preprint that we registered with before sticking it on getting into a peer-reviewed journal. And one thing to comment on briefly around that is there are some lesser known or lesser embraced approaches with pre-registering methodology and more broadly or philosophically trying to tackle a bunch of the ways that we tend to resort to competition and hoarding data or protecting our IP in the scientific publishing sense that I think we really need to address. And I think there are several DeSci groups. A couple of them are newer than this image that maps out most of the DeSci DAOs, but there are several DeSci community groups that are aiming to tackle basically how we can improve a lot of these incentivization structures, including what is so largely driven by institutions today.
Hi, so I was looking at your previous slide where you're talking about LLMs and about applying knowledge and insights from disparate literatures. So how far, is my question, how far do you think this can be automated? So in other words, let's say you have all these different repositories of studies, okay, and you feed it all into a giant LLM which can point out these possible connections from one paper to the other paper, from one paper's discoveries and things it establishes towards another paper where it asks, is this available? Okay, so that's, I mean, I understand that's what you're going towards. Okay, so my question is, how far can you scale this?
I would say that I don't see any clear-cut boundary of this is the limit, and we would have to curate and never be able to automate any significant chunk of the solution space. It would take the time and effort to carve out what would be a novel solution space or approach to propose. And I think that the vast majority of it can be automated, including the checks and balances. I think one of the rate limiting challenges right now that certainly I've been caught up on is trying to address an algorithmic way to evaluate knowledge. Not only find and search and find similar knowledge on some indexing, but to actually evaluate, is this consistent? Is this similar in a knowledge comprehension level, and not just actually looking at reasoning comprehension and not just is the wording statistically similar? And I don't know that I have a solution yet, but I think that could be possible to automate, and it could even come down to knowledge graphs with deep CNNs, with being able to actually look at, so similar to the current knowledge graphs, they're looking at basically mapping out the knowledge. How do you then evaluate the relationships and how robust something is? I've been trying to structure some case studies on knowledge that has gotten overturned, that there's a consensus that this is old, this is the new paradigm, and trying to figure out how to structure that into a knowledge graph or some other sort of algorithmic structure to be able to evaluate, are there any algorithmic rules that could tie this together to seed a way to automate through computing and evaluating knowledge. So still trying to figure that out, but I suspect knowledge graphs will be very powerful.
Thank you. So I have a personal story from my professional career. I worked at a pharmaceutical company, and I was trying to start an initiative that was in fact outside of my vertical. I was in IT, I was developing in-house infrastructure, web applications, and we had a preclinical group that was doing drug development. And I reached out to the preclinical group to do a machine learning project for drug discovery. So it was a very active collaboration. Now, we ended up getting derailed, and I'd like your opinion on the incentive structures. So we were about just over the year mark in, and one of my key allies within the preclinical had left, and I thought that we were okay. Turns out that preclinical terminated the program from their side because they just they didn't see the value in it. Basically, I think it was a communications issue. That year, for me as an engineer, I saw what we were doing behind the scenes with infrastructure development. For them, they saw a void that they didn't understand because it's not their realm. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are as far as what are the metrics for framing a horizontal project, or how do you frame it, and how do we address those incentives? I understand that for preclinical's year-end review, they weren't too happy because they didn't have anything to show. but that's par for the course from an engineering style project, and we're just approaching it with kind of two different frames of reference for what's normal. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we can do horizontal metrics or horizontal framing.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I've actually had a similar lived experience myself of the project that got derailed effectively by collaborators that were so worried that we were not making tangible progress because it didn't amount to what made sense in the way one individual or professional frames just what progress and success looks like. I see nothing that resembles engineering, or I see nothing that resembles biology, or what's the preclinical value, what's the clinical trial ramp and pathway, and just it can be difficult. And I think it really would come down to an effort of communication to sort of build a collaborative pathway and carve out what would the path forward look like, to actually think so differently that we can propose and agree on a new incentive structure that is not only incentivized by, well, I'm funded by this, and I've got to deliver what will get me more funding from that avenue, or we make profit around this preclinical to clinical pathway, and it has to fit into this box. So I think that's still a very underdeveloped problem space that is still very young, but I think establishing that confidence to really push to begin to foster better communication, collaboration, and training across disciplines is a big piece of that pie, of being able to actually look at even just a post-mortem of taking specific examples of just open-minded professionals that are well-meaning and able to look at the objective, reality, where you can actually look at what is justifiable, what is objectively happening, and maybe even what was subjective, what was maybe a failure or lacking that should have been more subjective sometimes. Sometimes we get bogged down with it has to be objective and logical, when sometimes the driver and the motivator to solve a problem that needs a lot more attention, that has so much unmet needs, is actually more than just something that you could ever tackle with only objective approaches. So I guess I just want to put in that last word around the subjective side, that sometimes that is not only driving the derailment, but also even more necessary for the recovery.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I've been wondering, who do you think is the ideal audience to get this message across to? You mentioned like a conference in South Africa, maybe you have an idea about does it start with students, does it start within academia, does it go higher than that?
Sure. I certainly would say, why not both? I would say I've yet to figure out who would be a poor fit to sort of push the boundaries and figure out a more productive way forward and what we need to make better progress and have more impact, to sort of look beyond what so many different walks of life, so many different types of professionals, even, as you say, students, where you're not per se a professional finished with the professional training yet if you're still in schooling. There's so many different walks of life that are not exclusive to any unique discipline or niche, I would say, where just everyone could benefit from a better way of being able to tackle and make a more robust way to rigorously handle these sort of frameworks and perspectives that might be justifiable and make sense to, say, scientific researchers or even far beyond. Any professional in any walk of life interacts with structures that are very reductive and just it's inherent to society. Just the way we decided a long time ago, Western medicine, you choose an organ and that organ is going to be your specialty. And then biology, you typically look at, you should only be allowed to specialize on one cell, one protein, one condition. And those vertical bins I was talking about earlier have the innate structures where it's this data repository is based on cells, one per cell type, or proteins, or conditions, or methodology like proteomics, but not much connecting those dots. So I think there's a long way left to go, and I'm still trying to figure out the most promising avenue to begin actually entertaining the more robust conversation around this. But I think just having anyone be able to dabble with this conversation, just allowing it to begin happening, would be a sign of progress.
Hi. So I've been a lifelong scientist. I've worked in research a lot of my whole career, and anybody who works in science knows that the vast majority of things that you try out, the vast majority of ideas, don't work out. It's really just a few of them. But even those failures are also useful knowledge, right? Every time you try something that doesn't work, you know something you didn't know before. And yet, in my 20-year career, I've never read a paper that said, we tried this and this and that, and they didn't work. That's just not publishable, right? Every paper needs to show how they push the state of the art and they discover something amazing. You can't write something that said, wow, that didn't work, even though that's really useful. So what ends up happening is that every lab starts replicating these same things because no one told them that that idea has been tried and didn't work. Because there's no journal called Journal of Negative Results.
There is at least one.
So my question, which I guess he's trying to answer, what should we do with all this mountain of negative data, which could be used by somebody, but there's just no home for it right now?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. There is at least one journal that prioritizes negative results or all-inclusive data. I forget the exact name of it. It might be pretty close to the wording of the Journal of Negative Results from my memory. I'll try to look that up shortly, but I would say that it sort of overlaps with the concept of what would it even take to collect new data if we're pretty confident that there's no existing data, not only in a repository that's open source or available outside of the original data collection, but just was there ever any generated data set that was comprehensive enough to look at everything that with the current incentives and structures and repositories we have the ability to share and communicate or just facilitate to be able to access. Would we even be able to make something open source that was generated, or would we have to think of a whole new way of generating data that could actually look at the collaborative approach rather than competitive mindset that would maybe solve a lot of the bottlenecks of I have to hoard this data, I have to find the positive results somehow, as difficult as science is, and to neglect or forget about the negative results. It sort of becomes hard to even talk about, even at a conference. But I think that there's a lot of progress up to go to embrace repositories that could actually aim to communicate the already generated data, what the lackings were, and why you maybe didn't get a proposal approved if you got feedback, why you maybe struggled with the methodology and the eventual success before publishing, and all those perspectives that really I don't see any reason to remain competitive. It would take some time to resolve the current incentives to just flip them on their head. It would be difficult just tomorrow be radically different. But I think the DSI community makes a great argument and case study of successful young track records, but successful ones, beginning to look at even those publishing paradigms and data sharing paradigms. There's one I'll point out is WeaveChain in the middle-ish box data storage and protocols that has an open source and free blockchain technology tool that is able to stay HIPAA and GDPR compliant with sensitive private data. So basically federated learning data hosting. And I think that's just one of many ways that we could begin to tackle something that we don't really think about or discuss very often, but we all sort of know about. There's these massive drawbacks, and how would we restructure incentives or address solutions where a lot of it could be automated, but I don't think everything is a matter of automation or computing. Even there is no end-all or single answer, as much as reductionism might make us want to think that we could find one comfy answer for any given single question. I think it's complicated, but I think we're making progress along the way.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah. If there are no other questions, let's give Mr. Keating a round of applause.